My name is Audrey Thompson. I'm 30 years old. A mother. A survivor of a toxic household. And until recently, a woman who tried her hardest to believe that family could still mean something. That belief shattered on a summer afternoon. In a place that should have felt safe. My daughter, Lily, was 6, wide-eyed, soft-spoken, and always trying to be good enough. We had been invited to my parents' lake house for the weekend. An annual gathering my family called Heritage Weekend. As if dysfunction could be made noble with wine and monograms. I hadn't been back in 3 years. Not since the divorce. Not since the whispered judgments about me being too emotional and not disciplined enough to keep a man. But I told myself it was time. That maybe, just maybe, they would have softened. That they could see Lily for who she really was, a miracle. Not a mistake. I was wrong. We arrived early Saturday morning. The air was thick with expensive cologne and passive aggression. My brother Derek was already there, tall, chiseled, radiating the same arrogant confidence that had made him my father's favorite since we were kids. His wife, Natalie, quiet and thin-lipped, smiled like someone who had practiced it in the mirror. My mother Eleanor greeted Lily with a stiff nod, and then gave me the same look she had given me at 17 when I told her I wanted to major in art, a mixture of confusion and disappointment. My father Howard clapped Derek on the back with pride and barely acknowledged me. But I smiled. For Lily's sake. I smiled through every bite of overcooked brunch and every backhanded compliment. You're still working at that little nonprofit, aren't you? Still renting? Lily's a bit shy, isn't she? That's not very Thompson-like. Every word was a pinprick. But I had learned to bleed quietly. That evening, Lily was helping Natalie set the table. She accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice. It spilled across the tablecloth, creeping toward Derek's sleeve. He stood up, furious. And before I could react, he slapped her. Hard. Not a warning tap. Not a scolding nudge. A full, open palm slap across her tiny face. Her cheek flushed red immediately. Her eyes widened. But she didn't cry. She just looked at me, confused, as if asking, did I do something wrong? Time slowed. I froze, not because I was unsure of what had happened, but because what came next felt more surreal than the slap itself. They laughed. My father chuckled. My mother smirked. Natalie gave a slight, disapproving shake of her head but said nothing. Derek adjusted his sleeve and muttered, well, maybe now she'll learn to respect other people's space. Lily was 6. 6. My daughter had just been assaulted in front of me. And my entire family acted as if it were a minor social correction. I took her hand. We walked out silently. My insides boiling, but my exterior composed. We didn't even put on our jackets. I buckled her into the car and drove. Hands shaking so badly, I had to pull over twice. She was silent the whole ride, only asking once, Mommy, was that my fault? I told her no. I told her she was perfect. But the truth was, I blamed myself. Not for the slap, but for ever thinking my daughter could be safe in the same house where I had spent years learning how to shrink myself to survive. When we got home, I ran her a warm bath, kissed the red mark on her cheek, and promised her it would never happen again. She asked if we would see Grandpa and Grandma next weekend. And I told her, not for a very long time. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, every second replaying in my mind. The sound of Derek's hand meeting her face. The way no one stopped him. The way they smirked. The way my mother once told me. Discipline builds character. After I cried from being grounded for 2 weeks over a B+ in high school, I was so deep in thought I didn't notice the message notification on my phone. It was from Paul, my cousin's husband. Audrey. It read, "I was recording audio for the family documentary all weekend. I got everything. Even that." My heart dropped. That I replied. He sent a voice note. I pressed play. And there it was. The slap. The laughter. My father's chuckle. My mother's voice. "That girl needs more discipline. Audrey's too soft. Derek. Maybe she'll grow a spine before she hits middle school." My breath caught in my throat. I felt fury. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that builds slowly. Purposefully. With focus. This was more than a bad moment. This was evidence. Not just for me. For anyone who had ever been gaslit into silence. I realized I wasn't just a daughter or a mother anymore. I was a witness. And I had a choice to make. Stay quiet. Or make sure the world finally saw them for who they truly were. And in that moment, standing alone in my dark kitchen, I knew exactly what I had to do, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I didn't sleep that night. After Paul sent me that recording, I must have listened to it 30 times. Every word peeled back another layer of what I thought I had already accepted about my family, but this time, there was no self-doubt. No mental gymnastics trying to justify what happened. This was real. It was archived. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't just my word against theirs. I had proof. I stared at the ceiling until morning. And when the sun began to bleed through the blinds, I wasn't tired. I was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. The weight on my chest hadn't lifted. But it had shifted into something sharper clarity. I texted Paul again. This time asking if he still had the raw footage from the family interviews. He did. He offered to meet me after work. We sat in his parked car at a Target lot, reviewing clips from the weekend. There they were, my parents. Derek. Even Natalie, each taking turns in front of the camera, spinning half-truths about family values and legacy. My mother smiled sweetly as she talked about the importance of tradition. My father spoke like a politician. Derek boasted about being the next leader of the family's financial empire. It was surreal. Their words were polished, carefully rehearsed, dripping with control. But none of it matched what I had experienced my entire life. It was a masterclass in curated abuse. Paul admitted something else. He had started recording things months ago quietly. Intentionally, after seeing how Derek treated Natalie behind closed doors. And how my parents enabled it. He had grown tired of playing the silent in-law. I thought maybe one day, if someone needed the truth, I'd have it. He said. Eyes locked on mine. I nodded. Overwhelmed, not just by gratitude, but by the growing realization that I wasn't the only one who had seen the cracks. I had simply been the first one punished for acknowledging them. That evening, I sat with Lily on the couch. We were coloring her happy place. She had drawn a picture of a little girl with a red mark on her face. I didn't say anything. I just held her close. When she fell asleep in my lap, I looked down at the drawing and knew what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge. It was about witnessing. About naming what had been unnamed for too long. About ending the story where the cycle always wins and beginning one where the truth matters even if it burns bridges that should have been ashes years ago. I began by documenting everything: dates, quotes, moments from childhood that connected with what had happened. I mapped out the behavioral patterns: favoritism, Emotional manipulation. Physical violence disguised as discipline. I went through old emails, texts, even birthday cards filled with subtle jabs. Every piece fit together like a puzzle I had once tried to unsee. Then I reached out to a friend of mine, Tara, who worked in podcast production. She had experience in audio editing, storytelling, and, more importantly, she had lived through her own family estrangement. When I sent her the audio file, she didn't say a word for a full 2 minutes. Then she said, "Audrey, this isn't just personal. This is systemic. And you need to let people hear it." We worked quietly for the next week. Tara helped me cut together a clean 4-minute segment, just enough to show the incident. The laughter, the degrading comments, and one final line. My mother's voice. Smug and oblivious. She's just like Audrey. Always fragile. It was a chilling line to end on. We decided to post it anonymously. No names. No faces. Just a story titled, "What Happens When a Family Protects the Wrong People." We uploaded it to a subreddit dedicated to family estrangement. Within 12 hours, it had over 10,000 upvotes. By morning, a parenting TikTok account had clipped the audio and turned it into a voiceover on a sketch. The comments poured in. People shared their own stories, echoes of mine. Some worse, some eerily similar. The post hit a nerve. But the real twist came when someone who had worked with Derek years ago messaged me privately. He had recognized the voice. Not just Derek's, but my father's, too. I always suspected something was off about them. He wrote, "Now I know." Word spread quickly after that. LinkedIn connections started to distance themselves. A parenting blogger with nearly 500,000 followers made a video called "Why You Should Believe the Scapegoat Daughter." It used a clip from our audio as the backdrop. The ripple effect was instant. Meanwhile, my mother emailed me. Furious. She accused me of publicly humiliating the family. She didn't deny what happened. She just couldn't believe I hadn't protected the image of the Thompsons. My father called once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Cool and clipped. "You've made a terrible mistake. This is your last chance to make it right." I didn't respond. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. Not by them, but by the strangers who understood me better than my own blood ever had. The final nail came a few days later. Paul, bless him, leaked the full recording to a journalist friend who ran a newsletter about toxic power dynamics in families and workplaces. The article was titled "The Slap That Unraveled a Dynasty." She had done her homework. She traced the family's financial dealings, the legacy brand my father built, Derek's attempts to pivot into politics. She didn't name me, but the quotes were there. The audio was embedded. It couldn't be ignored anymore. Natalie left Derek soon after. Quietly. With the kids. I heard through Paul that she had moved in with her sister. No custody battle. Just a clean break. My father's firm issued a press statement about an internal review of leadership conduct. My mother deactivated all social media. Derek went dark. And me. I stayed quiet for now. Because while the internet's attention span is short, healing isn't a trend. But as I watched it all unfold, I felt something unfamiliar begin to settle in me. Not glee. Not revenge. But a sense of justice. Of course. I knew it wasn't over. There would be backlash. There always is. But I also knew I had something stronger than fear now, the truth. And the courage to use it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to use it again, this time, not to destroy, but to rebuild something new. Something Lily could grow up proud of. Because what happens after justice? After the storm of revelation settled and the world had seen my family's darkest truths, something unexpected happened. I found myself standing at a crossroads not just of vengeance, but of healing. The victory wasn't loud or triumphant in the way movies paint it. There was no confetti or applause. Instead, it was quiet like the stillness after a forest fire. When the earth is raw but ready to grow again. Lily and I moved to a small apartment a few miles from the chaos. A place filled with sunlight and soft walls that didn't echo with judgment. I started seeing a therapist. Someone who helped me unravel years of pain and taught me that strength wasn't just surviving but thriving. Slowly, I began to rewrite what family meant for me. But that didn't mean the wounds had healed. Some nights, Lily would wake from nightmares, whispering about the lake house and the harsh voices. And I realized how deep the damage went not just to her, but to me. All my life, I had fought shadows, the idea that I was less than, that my voice was unwanted, that love was conditional. Now, those ghosts lurked in different places in the silence between us, in the spaces where I held back, afraid to repeat patterns I never wanted her to inherit. So I made another vow. If I was going to build a future for Lily, I needed a community. People who didn't just say family but meant it. People who saw us, not as broken, but as brave. I reached out to Tara, my oldest friend, the one who had stood by me before the world turned its back. She invited us to join a support group for survivors of family abuse. The first meeting was overwhelming. Strangers shared stories that mirrored mine of neglect, of betrayal, of resilience. But there was also laughter, hope, and a fierce determination that shook me awake. I saw women and men who refused to be defined by their past, who were crafting lives of joy and purpose. It was the first time in years I didn't feel alone. At home, Lily blossomed. She found friends who celebrated her creativity and kindness. She started art classes, painting scenes of wild gardens and safe places. One day, she brought home a drawing of a tree growing through a cracked foundation. Roots entwined with broken bricks, but reaching for the sun. I didn't need an explanation. I knew she was telling our story, the pain and the promise. Watching her grow, I realized something else. The scars I carried weren't chains, they were reminders. Reminders that the past could hurt, but it didn't have to imprison. I wanted to give Lily something I never had, a legacy of love. Not fear. But the journey wasn't just inward. The ripples from the audio scandal had reached unexpected places. Local advocacy groups contacted me, asking if I'd speak at events or participate in campaigns to raise awareness about family violence and emotional abuse. At first, I was hesitant. Speaking meant reliving trauma. It meant opening old wounds in front of strangers. But then I thought about Lily and the millions of children who might be suffering in silence, hidden behind smiles and perfect portraits. I decided I couldn't stay quiet anymore. My first public talk was at a small community center. The room was filled with people whose eyes were heavy with their own stories. When I stepped on stage, I felt the familiar rush of nerves, but also a strange strength. I shared pieces of my story, the slap, the laughter, the betrayal, but also the courage it took to fight back. When I finished, the applause was soft but real, and dozens of people came forward to thank me, to share their pain and hope. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for many who had felt invisible for too long. Meanwhile, the Thompsons remained fractured. Derek's career had stalled. Natalie's departure had been quiet but final. My parents rarely contacted me anymore. Their pride wounded deeper than their public image. It wasn't revenge that had undone them, it was accountability. And in that accountability, I found a bittersweet peace. I understood that some families aren't meant to be repaired. Sometimes, survival means choosing who you call family and letting go of those who refuse to change. One night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will ever say sorry?" I swallowed hard. The truth was complicated. I didn't know if they were capable of the humility that apology demands. But I told her, sometimes people don't say sorry. But we can still forgive them. Forgiveness is for us, not them. She nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. In that moment, I realized forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it could free us from its weight. It was the final step in our healing, a step I was ready to take. As I walked out of her room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the scared girl who had once stayed silent. She was someone who had reclaimed her voice, her story, her future. Someone who would protect her daughter at all costs and build a legacy rooted in love, truth, and strength. But even as peace settled in, I knew the story wasn't over. Healing is rarely a straight path. There would be challenges ahead, whispers, confrontations, moments of doubt. Yet for the first time, I felt ready, because I was no longer alone. And this time, I was standing on my own foundation, solid, unshakable, and built to last. The days following my first public talk were a whirlwind of emotions and new responsibilities. The small community center event had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, but now that I had, I couldn't turn back. Messages flooded in from strangers who had felt invisible for decades. Mothers, daughters, siblings, all sharing their own stories of silence and pain. Each one a thread weaving a tapestry of survival that made me feel part of something bigger than my own wounds. It was overwhelming, but also healing. I realized that my voice, once broken and dismissed, was now a beacon for others. But with visibility came scrutiny. The Thompsons, my family, didn't take kindly to having their secrets exposed. The fallout in their circles was palpable: muted phone calls, cold shoulders at social functions, whispered conversations ending abruptly when I entered the room. I learned that Derek was quietly lobbying former colleagues to discredit me, painting me as unstable and vindictive. My parents refused to speak to me. Their silence, a different kind of punishment. And Natalie's departure had left Derek bitter and isolated, his charm fading like a candle in a storm. Yet, despite the backlash, I refused to be silenced. The more they tried to erase me, the louder I became. I partnered with local nonprofits, joining panels, writing articles, and participating in podcasts that focused on breaking cycles of family abuse. I became a reluctant advocate, a role I never sought, but one I embraced fiercely. Every speech I gave, every story I shared, was a small victory against the dark legacy I had inherited. Lily thrived amidst the chaos. Her laughter filled our apartment, a bright counterpoint to the shadows that once loomed so large. She started therapy herself, learning tools to process her trauma and build resilience. Watching her heal became my greatest motivation. I wanted to build a world where she felt safe, seen, and valued, not just as my daughter, but as a person with dreams and a voice. One afternoon, as I was preparing for a fundraiser, I received an unexpected message from Natalie. It was brief. "I'm sorry. You were right. I was scared. Maybe we can talk someday." For a moment, I was stunned. The woman who had stood silently by Derek's side, who had watched our family unravel without protest, was reaching out. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible yet. But the message reminded me that even the most broken can seek redemption. Meanwhile, my parents' carefully constructed facade continued to crumble. My father's law firm lost several key clients after the scandal, and his influence waned. My mother, once the social queen of their circle, found herself excluded from events and charitable boards. The family dinners I once dreaded became awkward and sparse. It was a slow dismantling of power that felt both just and painfully necessary. In the midst of this, I found strength in unexpected places. Tara, my longtime friend, remained a constant pillar. We launched a small nonprofit focused on children who had experienced familial abuse, combining art therapy and community support. The project became a labor of love, a way to transform pain into purpose. We named it Roots of Light, inspired by Lily's drawing of the tree growing through broken ground. It was our statement of promise that from darkness, new life could grow. But just as the healing seemed steady, a new challenge emerged. Derek, desperate and cornered, began a campaign to undermine the nonprofit's credibility. Has spread rumors questioning my motives, accusing me of exploiting trauma for attention and money. The community was divided. Some stood with me. Others hesitated, unsure where the truth lay. It was a test not just of my resolve, but of everything I had built. The tension came to a head at a city council meeting where Roots of Light was up for a grant renewal. Derek showed up, accompanied by a lawyer and a handful of supporters. He spoke eloquently about accountability, calling into question my leadership and financial transparency. For a moment, I felt the old fear rise, a shadow of doubt creeping into my heart. But then I looked out at the room faces of survivors, volunteers, and allies who believed in our mission. I took a deep breath and told my story again. Not as a victim, but as a fighter. I spoke of the importance of trust, of community, and of transforming pain into healing. When the vote was called, the council approved the grant unanimously. It was a victory not just for me, but for every child who would find refuge through our work. As I stepped down from the podium, tears streamed silently down my face. The battle was far from over, but the war was beginning to tilt. That night, as I lay in bed beside Lily, I thought about how far we had come and how far we still had to go. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet see. But for the first time, I felt an unshakable certainty I was no longer defined by my family's past. I was building a legacy of my own, a legacy of courage, truth, and love. And as the city lights flickered beyond our window, I whispered a promise to myself and to Lily, no matter what came next. We would face it together, stronger, wiser, and unbroken. The months that followed marked a transformation I hadn't dared to imagine in the darkest moments of that summer. Roots of Light flourished beyond my wildest hopes, becoming a sanctuary for children and families caught in cycles of silence and pain. The stories I heard of heartbreak, survival, and ultimately, hope fueled my determination. It was a bittersweet symphony as my family fell further into ruin. The community around me grew stronger, but the greatest change was inside me. I was no longer just a survivor, I was a creator of new narratives. Lily's growth was my daily reminder of why I fought. Her laughter echoed through our small apartment like sunlight through a cracked window, fragile but beautiful. She was becoming fearless in ways I had never been. One evening, she came to me with a drawing she had made in school. It was of a large tree, its roots entwined with a broken foundation, reaching high into a bright sky. "Mom," she said quietly, "this is us. Strong. Even when things are broken." I held her close, tears blurring my vision. That moment crystallized everything our past would always be part of us. But it didn't have to define us. Yet, the shadow of my past was never fully gone. My parents remained distant. Their silence, a wall I could neither scale nor tear down. Derek's attempts to discredit me continued in whispers and legal threats. But the tide was turning. More people saw through the facade. The truth had weight now. And it was anchored in my work, my community, and the lives we touched. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was from my mother. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore her elegant handwriting, the same handwriting that had once filled my childhood with cold demands and expectations. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I wanted to reopen old wounds. But curiosity and a sliver of hope compelled me. Inside was a single page, a letter filled with cautious apologies and thinly veiled regret. She spoke of hard lessons and misguided attempts to protect our legacy. She asked if I could find it in my heart to meet her to talk, to maybe start a healing. I sat with the letter for days, turning it over in my mind. Forgiveness was complicated. I remembered the laughter, the slap, the silence. But I also remembered the woman who once tried, however imperfectly, to love me. In the end, I wrote back, agreeing to meet, not for reconciliation, but for understanding. I knew that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. The meeting was quiet and tense, a dance of unspoken memories and guarded words. My mother and I spoke of pain, fear, and the weight of expectations passed down like heirlooms. It was not a moment of complete healing, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread weaving between us. I realized that sometimes family means imperfect people trying to find common ground. As the seasons changed, so did I. My work with Roots of Light expanded to include programs for parents struggling to break free from cycles of abuse. I became a mentor, an advocate, a voice for those who had none. The community I had helped build became a family of choice, loyal, compassionate, and fierce in its love. I found strength in this chosen family, and in Lily's bright, hopeful eyes. Looking back, the slap that shattered our lives was both an end and a beginning. It ended the illusion of a perfect family and began the hard work of building a real one. I had learned that strength is not measured by silence or endurance, but by courage. The courage to stand, to speak, and to love fiercely, despite everything. One night, as Lily and I sat on the rooftop watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, she turned to me and said, "Mom, do you think people can really change?" I smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Sometimes," I said softly. "But what matters most is that we keep trying. For ourselves. And for those who come after us." And in that moment, under the vast sky, I felt a peace deeper than I had ever known, a peace born not from forgetting, but from choosing to live differently. To build a legacy not of silence and shame, but of truth, resilience, and unconditional love. Because family is not just blood. Family is the people who show up, the people who fight for you, the people who choose you again and again. And that is the story I am proud to tell. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize that this story, my story, is not just about a slap, or a broken family, or even revenge. It's about something far deeper, the universal struggle to find one's voice in a world that often tries to silence us. It's about the invisible battles that many face behind closed doors, where love is tangled with pain. And survival sometimes means choosing between loyalty and self-preservation. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that family is not always what we expect it to be. Blood ties don't guarantee love or safety. Sometimes, the people who share our DNA are the ones who hurt us most deeply. But that doesn't mean we are powerless. We have the capacity to redefine family on our own terms, to create spaces where kindness, respect, and understanding replace judgment and cruelty. The pain of betrayal, especially when it comes from those who are supposed to protect us, cuts at the very core of our identity. For years, I carried the burden of feeling not just hurt, but unseen. Not just abused, but blamed. But in speaking my truth, in exposing the shadows that haunted my childhood and threatened my daughter's innocence, I reclaimed not only my voice but my dignity. I learned that telling your story is an act of courage and healing. Psychologically, the journey was complex. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating the past into a new narrative where trauma is acknowledged but no longer defines us. It means allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and strong at the same time. It means recognizing that anger, grief, and fear are valid responses, and that through them, we can find resilience. In sharing my experience publicly, I faced fears of judgment and rejection. But I also discovered the profound power of community. We humans are wired for connection. When we break silence, we invite others to do the same. We transform isolation into solidarity. That transformation is at the heart of all social change and personal growth. Ethically, I wrestled with the concept of revenge. It's easy to think of revenge as a simple act of retaliation. But real justice is far more nuanced. Justice means accountability balanced with compassion. It means using truth not to destroy, but to illuminate and rebuild. My decision to expose my family's abuses was not born from hatred, but from a deep desire to protect my daughter and others like her. It was an act of moral responsibility. In the end, I found that true power lies not in vengeance, but in choosing love and integrity despite our scars. The world we inherit may be flawed, but the one we create can be better. That's the legacy I want for Lily. A legacy where she knows she deserves respect, where she knows her voice matters, where she knows that love doesn't hurt. This story is not unique. Millions of people live with family wounds, some visible, some hidden. But each of us has the potential to rewrite our narratives, to find or build families of choice that honor our worth and nurture our dreams. It's a reminder that survival is only the beginning. The real work is thriving, loving, and passing on hope. If you've ever felt trapped by the expectations or cruelties of your past, know that you are not alone. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you have the strength to change your path. So, I ask you, what does family mean to you? Who do you choose to stand with? How will you honor your own truth? As I close this chapter, I invite you to reflect and share your journey. Together, we can build communities where no child is silenced, no mother is ignored, and no truth remains buried. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gives you courage to speak, to heal, and to love fiercely. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your voice could be the light someone else needs. Story 2. My name is Emily. At 32, I thought I understood family support, respect, love. But sometimes, the people closest to you show a different side. This is the story of my son's wedding. The day I realized I was no longer a father in their eyes, just a wallet. And how I chose to respond not with anger, but with quiet, calculated resolve. For years, I worked hard in finance, no flashy title, no spotlight, just steady, dependable work. When Jake, my only son, announced his wedding plans, I poured myself into making it perfect. The venue, the catering, the band, the travel arrangements, I handled every detail and every bill without complaint. I thought that's what being a supportive parent meant. But as the days went by, I noticed I was being pushed aside. The bride's family took over. And even when I offered help, I was gently but firmly told, "We've got it." I told myself it was just wedding chaos and tried to stay in the background, playing the role of the quiet provider. At the rehearsal dinner, I sat alone at the far end of the table, next to a coworker of the bride and a fidgeting toddler. Jake's stepfather, a man who'd only been in the family a year, gave a heartfelt speech about the fine young man Jake had become. Everyone applauded. Jake smiled proudly, as if nothing was unusual. I swallowed the lump in my throat and clapped, pretending the empty seat beside me didn't ache. The wedding day came. My seat was even further back behind the florist's assistant. When it was time to sign the marriage certificate, my name wasn't on it. It was the stepfather's. He stood beside Jake during the toast. The speeches ignored me completely. Smiles, photos, laughter, all masks I wore to hide how deeply I was wounded. As the night wound down, Jake approached me. He patted my shoulder with that smug grin I remembered from his childhood and said, "Thanks for covering everything, old man." His words cut sharper than any insult, no gratitude, just dismissal. I went home, sat at my desk, and made a decision. I called the bank and froze the final payment scheduled for the wedding bills, venue, DJ, photographer, travel reimbursements, all paused. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just a quiet statement I was done being invisible. Days later, the calls began. Vendors confused about unpaid bills, trying to reach Jake or me. I told them to speak directly with Jake. My involvement was over. Texts arrived, not from Jake, but from his mother, stepfather, and in-laws full of passive-aggressive complaints about embarrassment and unfairness. I ignored them all. Finally, Jake sent me a message, no call, asking if something was wrong with the bank. I didn't reply. The silence that followed was louder than any argument I could have made. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about respect. About being seen and valued for more than just what I could provide. I realized I'd been reduced from father to financier, a wallet to be used and discarded. So I planned my next move not with anger, but with quiet resolve. I wouldn't beg for acknowledgement. I'd let the consequences of their actions unfold naturally. I stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages. I stepped out of their story and into my own. Weeks passed. Vendors demanded payment from Jake and his family. The honeymoon plans faltered. Vendors threatened legal action. The carefully built facade began to crumble. Still, I stayed silent, watching as their illusion cracked. Jake finally came to me, not angry, not apologetic, just overwhelmed. He hadn't realized how much I had done. We talked not about blame, but about boundaries, about respect, about rebuilding what had been broken. Our relationship began to heal, founded on honesty rather than obligation. I started spending on myself, small joys I'd long neglected. The stepfather's presence faded. The spotlight shifted. For the first time in years, I felt free. But this freedom came not from a loud confrontation, but from the quiet courage to say, enough. The courage to demand respect not just for what I do, but for who I am. And that is the story I want to share. Because many of us know what it feels like to be unseen, unappreciated, taken for granted. And sometimes, the only way to be heard is through silence and self-respect. So, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you confront, walk away, fight quietly? Let me know in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, please like and subscribe. There's more coming, stories that peel back the layers of family, betrayal, and redemption. But for now, this is where my story begins, at the edge of silence, on the brink of change. After that night, the silence in my house felt heavier than any confrontation I could have had. No one called. No one texted. Just empty echoes where once there was laughter, obligation, and expectation. The wedding was over. The bills unpaid. And yet the wound was deeper than money lost. It was the realization that I was no longer a part of their lives, except as a bank account to be tapped or discarded. Days later, I returned to my routine. I went to work. I walked my dog. I cleaned the garage. But underneath the calm surface, my mind raced. I kept replaying Jake's words, the casual dismissal disguised as gratitude, and the hollow faces at the wedding. The smiles that didn't reach their eyes when they looked my way. I thought of the countless hours I'd worked, the sacrifices I'd made, the silent battles fought just to keep the family afloat. And now, I was the forgotten. One morning, an email popped up from the photographer's office, a demand for full payment before releasing the digital photos. Another from the hotel, threatening cancellation of the block booking. The decorator had already left a final invoice with the bride's parents. They were scrambling, trying to pick up pieces I once carefully held together. I forwarded every message to Jake's inbox. It wasn't my mess to clean anymore. My role had shifted irrevocably. Watching from the sidelines, I realized how much I had enabled, not maliciously, but through love and responsibility. And that enabling came at a price: my own worth, my own voice. Jake called one evening, his voice hesitant, unfamiliar. No anger, no blame, just exhaustion and confusion. He admitted he hadn't understood how much I had done, how I had kept everything running behind the scenes. He said he wanted to talk not about money or vendors, but about us, about rebuilding something new. That call was a fragile bridge, but it was something. I listened, offered nothing but presence. For once, the burden was shared, the expectations clearer. Meanwhile, the other voices grew louder. Jake's stepfather and mother kept their distance, their disapproval simmering beneath polite silences. The bride's family was firmly aligned against me, a silent reminder that the old roles I once held were fading. Yet amidst the chaos, I found unexpected clarity. I began spending on small things, dinners for one, a weekend getaway to a quiet cabin, a new book that wasn't about business or responsibility. These were gifts to myself, tokens of a life not defined by others' expectations but by my own terms. I learned to savor silence, the kind that doesn't weigh on your chest but lifts it. But freedom, I realized, came with consequences. Friends whispered. Neighbors noticed. The family narrative shifted. I was suddenly the one who walked away, the one who abandoned them. I watched as stories twisted in their favor. But I no longer cared for their version of truth. The most painful part was not the lies but the absence of apology, the refusal to see me as anything but a provider. They missed the man who built the foundation beneath their feet because they never looked down. And so, I stood my ground. Not with anger, but with quiet dignity. I refused to be invisible any longer. One late afternoon, Jake showed up at my door. No fanfare. No dramatics. Just a man wanting to bridge the gap. We talked for hours about mistakes, expectations, and the cost of silence. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of years pressing down. But for the first time, it was not suffocating. It was the weight of lessons learned, boundaries set, and the beginning of healing. The next chapter was uncertain, but for once, I was ready to write it on my own terms. And as I looked out the window at the fading light, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again sacrifice myself to be seen as invisible. After that quiet night with Jake, the days that followed brought a strange mixture of relief and tension. The silence between us wasn't cold, it was tentative, like the fragile first steps on new ground. For years, I had been the one who managed the chaos, the quiet force that held things together. Now, that force had shifted, and the family was scrambling to find balance without me. Yet, even as Jake and I began tentative talks, the others were weaving their own narratives. Ones where I was the villain, the disruptor. I noticed at first in small ways, the pointed looks when we crossed paths, the hushed conversations that stopped as I entered the room. Erin, my sister, was especially relentless. She masked her jealousy with forced smiles and concerned questions that cut sharper than any insult. Her success was a bright spotlight that left me in shadow. But unlike before, I no longer shied away. I saw the tension in her eyes whenever I declined to help with her latest crisis or refused to bail her out of debt. The way she flinched when the topic of rent or bills came up told me she knew I was serious this time. My parents, too, shifted their tone. Gone were the days of subtle gratitude or quiet acceptance. No. They oscillated between cold indifference and desperate pleas, thinly veiled as family discussions. Mom would drop by with casseroles and stale apologies, while Dad's sighs grew heavier, as if carrying the weight of all the unspoken resentment. It was clear they felt the loss of my financial support keenly, but pride stopped them from admitting it openly. I realized they viewed their dependence on me as a given, an unspoken contract they never intended to honor. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the crossroads of anger and empathy. The woman who raised me, the woman who once held me as a child when the world was cruel, was now a stranger weighed down by her own failures. I saw the lines etched deeper on her face, the weariness in her posture. Yet, beneath it all was a mother's longing, a hope that I might come back, that the family could somehow be whole again. But I was done being the safety net. the invisible glue. My boundaries were no longer negotiable. The realization that love without respect was a cage, not a home, hit me with a quiet ferocity. I had spent too long bending, giving, forgiving, only to be taken for granted. So, I made a decision not out of spite, but out of necessity. I started reclaiming parts of my life that had been eclipsed by obligation. I picked up old hobbies, reconnected with friends I'd neglected, and allowed myself moments of joy without guilt. For the first time in years, I dreamed not about what I owed to others, but about what I deserved. Yet, with every step forward, the family drama intensified. Aaron's passive-aggressive comments became overt challenges. The tension at family gatherings thickened, transforming into silent wars fought with glances and half-spoken words. It was as if my refusal to conform shattered a delicate balance they weren't ready to face. One evening, as I sat alone on my balcony, the city lights flickering below, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mom, a tentative olive branch, asking if we could talk. My heart raced. Was this the moment of reconciliation? Or another test of my resolve? I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, knowing that any response would reshape the fragile threads still connecting us. That night, I finally replied, not with anger, but with honesty. I told her I was willing to listen, but that things needed to change. That love demanded respect, not just financial support. The reply was slow, hesitant, but sincere. A door had opened. As days turned into weeks, small conversations paved the way for healing. I saw glimpses of the mother I remembered, beneath the defenses and disappointments. And with Jake, our talks deepened not just about the past, but about building a future where I was seen and valued. Yet, the greatest challenge was still ahead. The family's web of expectations and old roles did not unravel easily. The shadows of resentment lingered, threatening to pull us back into patterns I had fought so hard to escape. But this time, I was ready. I was no longer the silent giver. I was a woman reclaiming her worth, demanding to be seen not just for what I could provide, but for who I was. And with that determination, the story was far from over. The days that followed were a delicate dance of progress and setbacks. A fragile truce in a family long accustomed to unspoken rules and hidden resentments. Mom's messages grew more frequent, less guarded, revealing cracks in her armor, a softness beneath years of stoic pride. Our conversations, once terse and transactional, began to carry fragments of old warmth. Memories shared hesitantly as if testing waters too long left frozen. But healing in this family was never straightforward. Erin, my sister, seemed determined to resist any change that might diminish her carefully curated role as the golden child. Her smile no longer reached her eyes, and her sharp remarks disguised as jokes cut through the tentative peace. At a recent family dinner, she launched into a veiled critique about my absence, claiming I had abandoned the family when they needed me most. Her words landed like icy daggers, and the room fell silent, the weight of her accusation settling heavily over us all. I felt the familiar sting of betrayal. But this time, I didn't retreat or retaliate. Instead, I let the silence linger, letting the truth of my choices speak louder than any defense I could muster. The years of carrying the burden alone had not made me bitter, they had made me wise. I realized that no amount of anger or denial from them could change what I knew to be true. I had given enough, and it was time to live for myself. Jake was my anchor in this storm. His unwavering support was a balm to the wounds left by my family's coldness. One evening, as we watched the city lights from his apartment, I confided in him the depth of my pain, the loneliness of invisibility amidst people who were supposed to love me. He listened without judgment, his hand finding mine in quiet solidarity. In those moments, I understood that family could be chosen. And sometimes, those chosen bonds healed deeper than blood ties. Despite the personal victories, the fallout from my withdrawal rippled outward. The house, once bustling with my silent management, was now a hollow shell echoing with the consequences of neglect. The landlord's final notices piled up, and utility services were cut off one by one. I watched from afar as the facade of stability crumbled, not with satisfaction, but with a sober recognition of what happens when foundations are taken for granted. Mom's pride prevented her from admitting fault, but I glimpsed her desperation when she sent a tentative text asking if I could visit. It was an olive branch wrapped in layers of unspoken regret. When I arrived, the house smelled of dust and missed opportunities. We talked not just about bills or broken contracts, but about what had been lost in the silence between us. For the first time, her tears were real, not rehearsed, and I felt the fragile threads of forgiveness begin to weave. Yet, the biggest challenge remained Erin, who still clung fiercely to her place in the family hierarchy. Her refusal to acknowledge my boundaries threatened to unravel the fragile peace we'd begun to build. She pulled strings behind the scenes, whispering doubts to relatives, painting me as selfish and unstable. I knew these battles wouldn't end easily, that my fight was as much for my own dignity as for the hope of rebuilding trust. One day, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was from a distant relative I hadn't seen in years, someone who had quietly observed the family's dynamics from afar. Her words were simple but powerful. She saw the strength it took to walk away, to say no, to claim one's worth. Her message was a beacon of validation, a reminder that I was not alone, and that my story resonated beyond the walls that once confined me. That night, as I sat by the window, the city's hum, a distant lullaby, I felt a profound shift within. I was no longer the invisible pillar holding others up. I was a woman reclaiming her voice, her space, her life. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with pain and hope intertwined. But it was mine to walk. And this time, I was ready. The weeks that followed marked a turning point I had long awaited but never fully believed would come. Erin's subtle campaigns to undermine me met quiet resistance from others who had started to see beyond the family facade. Slowly, allies emerged, relatives and old friends who remembered the years I had stood as the invisible backbone. Their support was tentative at first. Whispered words over phone calls, private messages of encouragement that strengthened my resolve in moments of doubt. Mom, once distant and proud, began attending therapy, a step she kept private but that I learned of through mutual contacts. It was a sign not of surrender, but of growth. Our conversations became more honest, painful confessions replacing years of silence. She admitted, not in words but in actions, the cost of pride and neglect. There were tears, apologies that didn't need to be spoken aloud, and a fragile rebuilding of trust that had once seemed impossible. The house remained empty most days, a symbol of what had been lost and a canvas for what could still be reclaimed. I visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jake, imagining the life that might have been if things had been different. Each visit was a reminder that healing was not linear, that sometimes progress came in moments of quiet reflection rather than grand gestures. Erin's attitude softened gradually, the facade of confidence cracking as she faced the reality of independence without my financial safety net. I saw glimpses of vulnerability beneath her sharp tongue. A woman grappling with the consequences of choices made easier by my silent support. We didn't reconcile overnight, but the icy distance between us thawed with tentative conversations about accountability and family. It was not perfect, and there were days when old wounds resurfaced. But the door to dialogue remained open. Amidst this, I found new purpose beyond the family drama. I reconnected with passions long buried: writing, art, travel, things that had been sidelined in the years I spent holding everything together. Jake encouraged me, pushing me to chase dreams I had postponed. Our relationship deepened, built not just on comfort but on mutual respect and shared aspirations. Then came the moment I had dreaded and yet anticipated: a family gathering without pretense, without agendas, where we all faced each other as flawed, fragile humans. It was awkward at first. Apologies were sparse and tentative, but they were there. I stood quietly as my family spoke, listening more than speaking, absorbing the weight of unsaid regrets and hopes for the future. When I finally spoke, it was not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity and strength. I laid out what I had endured, what I had sacrificed, and why I had chosen to step back. My words were met with silence, then a tentative acceptance. No miraculous healing happened that day, but a foundation was laid: a fragile, imperfect, but real beginning. As I left that gathering, I felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. The path ahead was uncertain, the scars still raw, but for the first time in years, I felt free, not from them, but from the chains of invisibility and obligation I had borne for too long. The story doesn't end with perfect closure. Life rarely does. It ends with a woman who chose herself, who reclaimed her worth, and who forged a new narrative on her own terms. The family I had known might never be the same, but I had found something more important: my voice, my peace, my life. And that is the real victory. Story 3. My name is Emma Harris. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family's afterthought, the failure in the shadow of my older brother, Daniel, who was always the golden child, growing up in a typical Chicago suburb. The division in my family was clear: Daniel had the flashy office, the accolades, and the endless support from our parents. Meanwhile, I was relegated to a rusty old shed in the backyard, fixing engines and building prototypes, quietly working on what I believed could be my future. No applause, no encouragement, just silent dismissal. I accepted it, at least on the surface. It was the kind of thing you come to live with, like hand-me-down clothes or having to share a room you never wanted. But inside, the sting of invisibility never left. I watched as Daniel's ventures were celebrated, as my father boasted to friends about his future of the family, while I patched up the broken roof of my shed and taught myself to code. One stubborn step at a time. I was building something, but no one seemed to notice. That feeling, being unseen despite every ounce of effort, cut deep. Years passed. Daniel's startup was the family's pride: for a time branded polos, catered lunches, confident pitch. My shed was a sanctuary of quiet progress: old engines, 3D printed parts, blueprints scattered on a milk crate. When Daniel's business finally collapsed, as I'd feared it would, he didn't come to me for help right away. But then, one day, he appeared at my shed door. A little older, a little humbler, and asked to join forces. I handed him a job application instead of a partnership agreement. The look of disbelief on his face was telling. He hadn't expected me to treat him like anyone else. That was the first sign the old dynamic was changing. But Daniel didn't take the application seriously. Instead, he tried to attach himself to my growing business behind my back, reaching out to suppliers, misrepresenting himself, and undermining my authority. When I found out, I faced him with cold, undeniable proof. No shouting, no drama, just a firm boundary, no more free rides, no more betrayals. I was done with being the overlooked sister. From the moment I put my foot down, the family dynamics shifted. Quietly but irrevocably. My business grew beyond the shed, into a modest but professional space, staffed by eager engineers and clients who trusted what I built. The old family tension lingered, but the playing field had leveled. My parents sent a hesitant, almost apologetic letter. Daniel sent a brief message, no promises, no pitches, just a nod of respect, too late to matter. Driving past the house one evening, I realized how far I'd come from the cold shed where they put me aside, to a place I owned on my own terms. That journey from shadow to light wasn't just about business. It was about reclaiming my worth. But beneath the triumph, there was a quiet ache. The family I wanted wasn't the one I had. They saw me as the failure, the outsider. Until I stopped playing by their rules. The silence now between us isn't just absence, it's the echo of years spent trying to prove something that was never really seen. And as I look forward, I know this isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. What happens when the forgotten stops fading away and starts making waves? That's what you're about to hear. After that, tense confrontation in the shed. I thought maybe the worst was over. Daniel wouldn't push anymore. He'd accepted his place. Or, so I hoped. But family isn't that simple. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle shifts in their behavior. The kind that whispered of growing resentment and unspoken plans. My parents, especially Dad, started acting more distant, like they were walking on eggshells around me. They kept up appearances at family dinners, but the cold glances and half-smiles told a different story. I remembered the countless times I had stayed silent when Daniel was praised, when my ideas were dismissed, when I was asked to fix things no one else wanted to touch. I tolerated it, hoping for recognition. For just one moment, when they'd see me for who I was, not the shadow, but a person carving her own path. But their silence now felt like a verdict. I wasn't family anymore. Not in the way that mattered. Then came the first blow. One of my suppliers called, confused and hesitant. Someone claiming to represent my company had approached them without my consent, pitching deals and making promises I hadn't authorized. I knew immediately it was Daniel. He was trying to reinsert himself into my world without permission, hoping to ride the momentum I'd built. I didn't confront him that day. Instead, I documented everything: emails, calls, messages. I updated contracts, locked down vendor agreements, and tightened every loose end. I was protecting what was mine, quietly but firmly. When Daniel reached out with a polished proposal for a merger, I didn't reply. A few days later, he pressed harder. Speaking of investors, scaling, and brand expansion, But beneath the business jargon, I sensed desperation, a man grasping for relevance in a story he no longer controlled. The next weekend, Daniel showed up unannounced at the house, pitching his vision again in front of my parents. I walked in silently, placed the evidence before them, and laid out the truth. No theatrics, just facts. The room went still. Mom looked shocked, Dad speechless, and Daniel defeated. I told them I wasn't interested in a partnership born of ego and desperation. That if anyone tried to use my name or work without permission, I would fight it legally. No room for negotiation. No room for past grievances. That moment was more than a confrontation. It was a turning point. The old family script was broken, replaced by a new reality where I refused to be sidelined. The house, the dinners, the whispered judgments. None of it defined me anymore. Days turned into weeks. My business thrived, and the family tension faded. But not because they accepted me, they simply stopped pretending. Daniel launched another venture, one I ignored. My parents adjusted to the new normal. But the distance between us grew wider, filled with things left unsaid and wounds left raw. One morning, a letter arrived. Dad's handwriting. Uneven but sincere. No apologies. Just acknowledgement of my accomplishments and a hesitant pride. I folded it carefully, unsure what to do with this fragile bridge. Around the same time, Daniel sent a short message, no demands, no pitches. Just a hope that I was well and an offer of help if ever I needed it. I didn't respond. Driving past the house that night, I saw the old shed standing quietly in the backyard. It was weathered, worn, but solid, just like me. That shed had been my exile and my sanctuary. It had been where they pushed me aside, but also where I built everything that now stood as proof of my resilience. And as I looked ahead, I knew this wasn't just my victory, it was a testament to anyone who's ever been overlooked but refused to disappear. The real question now was what happens when the forgotten decides to take center stage. The message came late one night, an anonymous tip sent to a key investor in my company. Someone was trying to poison the well, planting doubts about my business ethics, questioning the legitimacy of my contracts, insinuating that I'd manipulated my family's assets to get ahead. I stared at the screen, disbelief crashing into a slow-burning anger. This wasn't just an attack on my work, it was an assault on my character, my integrity, everything I'd fought to build. Who would do such a thing? The answer was painfully obvious. Daniel. He hadn't given up. Instead, he was playing dirty, dragging our family's wounds into the mud to try and drag me down with him. The message wasn't just a smear, it was a calculated move to destabilize me, to make investors pull back, to fracture the trust I had painstakingly earned. I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest, the suffocating mix of betrayal and exhaustion. For years, I'd carried their dismissals like invisible scars, hoping to outwork the noise. But this was different. This was a war waged in the shadows, one I hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. I realized then that surviving the past battles meant nothing if I didn't learn to fight back smarter, faster, harder. I spent the next days meticulously gathering evidence, emails, financial records, third-party confirmations that would dismantle every lie they tried to spin. I hired a cybersecurity expert to trace the anonymous tips. And within a week, the source was identified. It was a family friend, someone Daniel had convinced to play the scapegoat. This revelation didn't bring relief, it brought a sharper clarity about how far they were willing to go. It wasn't just about business or inheritance anymore, It was about power, control, and keeping me silenced. But I wasn't going to let fear dictate my next move. With cold determination, I organized a private meeting with the investor and a few other key partners. I presented my case not just with facts and figures, but with the story behind every number. I spoke about late nights in the shed, the grit behind every prototype, the countless times I'd been overlooked, and the strength it took to keep going. I watched the skepticism in the room fade, replaced by respect, admiration, and a renewed commitment to support me. Meanwhile, news started to spread quietly. Business forums buzzed with whispers of the family feud, and sympathy grew for the underdog fighting, not just the market, but the very people who should have been her strongest allies. I felt a Couchia's hope, but I knew the battle wasn't over. Then came the twist no one expected. Daniel, in a public interview, blamed me for tearing the family apart, accusing me of greed and manipulation, painting himself as the victim. It was a desperate ploy for sympathy, but it backfired spectacularly. People saw the cracks in his story, the desperation behind his words, and the strength in mine. The family feud, once a private wound, became a public spectacle. Social media exploded with debates, opinions, and countless voices taking sides. Friends and strangers alike shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. I realized then how universal this fight was: the yearning to be seen, to be valued, to claim one's rightful place. Through the chaos, I held on to the truth I knew deep inside, that success wasn't just about what you built, but who you become in the process. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. In The Forgotten Daughter, I was a woman who had rewritten her story on her own terms. But as I prepared for what felt like the final act in this saga, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the family's fight wasn't just about business or pride anymore. It was about survival, and sometimes survival meant going further than I ever thought possible. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Late one evening, I received an encrypted email from an unknown source, offering a trove of confidential family documents, bank statements, offshore accounts, hidden loans, all carefully concealed from me and the rest of the family. The sender claimed this was the missing piece that explained decades of financial maneuvers designed to exclude me from true ownership and control. My heart pounded. This wasn't just dirt to throw. This was proof that everything I had suspected about their manipulation was true. As I sifted through the files, a cold wave of betrayal washed over me. These weren't just innocent oversights or family secrets. They were calculated decisions, made repeatedly by the very people who claimed to love me. The years of supporting them, footing bills, and trying to keep peace suddenly felt like an elaborate facade. I was not just the forgotten sibling, I was the scapegoat, the silent investor who'd been robbed of her rightful stake. I sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing down. But beneath the shock, a fierce resolve took hold. This was the moment I needed deserved to turn the tables. But it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a tangled web of trust, deceit, and money. Exposing it meant tearing the family apart publicly, risking alliances, and forever changing what little connection remained. Days blurred into nights as I worked with my attorney and financial advisors to piece together a legal strategy. We mapped out the layers of deception, identified assets that could be reclaimed, and prepared for the inevitable fallout. It was a chess game, each move calculated to strike a balance between justice and survival. But the family had its own plans. Within hours of the information leak becoming known, Whispers turned into denials. Denials into threats. My parents, always the masters of control, launched a public campaign painting me as a greedy opportunist, bent on destroying the family legacy. Daniel, desperate to salvage his crumbling reputation, appeared on local podcasts, spinning tales of betrayal and heartbreak, blaming me for fracturing a once close family. The pressure mounted relentlessly. Friends reached out with words of caution. Advisors warned me of the emotional toll this battle would exact. But I could no longer stay silent. No longer bear the invisible chains of guilt and obligation. Every lie they told about me was a fresh wound. Every accusation, a challenge to rise stronger. Amid this storm, unexpected allies emerged. Old family, friends, distant cousins, and even some business partners who had witnessed the truth in private conversations began stepping forward. Their voices lent weight to my cause, painting a picture of resilience and righteousness rather than selfishness and greed. Yet, the most powerful moment came from within. One night, as the house grew quiet and the city lights flickered through the window, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The past, the pain, the endless battles, they all coalesced into a single burning question. What did I truly want from this justice, revenge, or something more? The answer was clear: I wanted freedom. Freedom from the lies, from the resentment, from the years of invisibility. I wanted to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my dignity, my voice, my place in the world. And I was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. With renewed clarity, I sent a final, unambiguous message to my family's lawyer, a demand for a full audit, transparency, and a restructuring of the trust under my terms. I knew this would be the spark that ignited the fiercest confrontation yet. But I wasn't afraid. Because this time, I wasn't just fighting for money or recognition. I was fighting for the woman I had become, the one who refused to be invisible any longer. The days following my demand were a whirlwind of chaos. The family's carefully curated image shattered almost overnight as whispers of legal battles and financial misconduct seeped into the community. Social media became a battleground. Friends and acquaintances picked sides, some defending the loyal family narrative my parents tried to uphold, others quietly applauding my courage to stand up against years of neglect and manipulation. The personal was now painfully public. My phone buzzed incessantly, not just with messages of support, but with veiled threats and desperate pleas from relatives trying to broker peace, to convince me to drop the fight. I ignored most. The silence I embraced was a shield, a space to focus and plan rather than be swayed by guilt or nostalgia. I had crossed a line they hoped I never would, and now they scrambled to contain the damage. At the same time, I immersed myself in the business I had built from the ground up. It became my sanctuary, a place where my worth wasn't measured by family approval but by the tangible results of hard work and innovation. Each order fulfilled, every satisfied customer, was a quiet victory. The contrast between my flourishing company and their faltering facade was unmistakable, though I never gloated. Then came the mediation meeting, a formal setting where legal representatives, family members, and I sat around a sterile table. My parents wore masks of contrition, but their eyes betrayed calculation. Daniel was quieter than usual, eyes darting nervously as the layers of truth unfolded. I presented my case with unwavering clarity: documents, testimonies, timelines, each piece carefully chosen to dismantle their defenses without unnecessary cruelty. It wasn't easy. The conversation swung between accusations, justifications, and emotional outbursts. But amid the tension, A strange clarity emerged. The family dynamic, once tangled in unspoken resentments and passive aggressions, was now brutally exposed. We weren't just fighting over money, we were confronting years of disregard, unbalanced sacrifices, and fractured trust. As the mediation closed with an agreement to restructure the family trust and ensure transparency, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least the walls of secrecy were breaking down. More importantly, I had reclaimed a voice that was long silenced. In the weeks that followed, I received messages from relatives I barely knew, expressing quiet respect or tentative reconciliation. Some sought my advice for their own struggles. Others simply wanted to understand. It was a reminder that even in broken families, healing is possible, though it requires honesty and courage. Yet, not all wounds would heal quickly. My parents retreated into their own world of regret and denial, occasionally reaching out with hollow apologies. Daniel disappeared from social circles, his attempts to rebuild tarnished by the revelations. But I was no longer invested in their redemption. My focus was forward, on building a legacy defined by integrity and self-respect. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new office overlooking the city skyline, I reflected on the journey, the pain, the battles, the loneliness. It all shaped me. But it didn't define me. I was no longer the overlooked sibling, the silent caretaker. I was a woman who had fought, lost, and risen. And as the lights of the city flickered below, I smiled softly, knowing that sometimes the greatest victory is simply to stand firm and refuse to be broken. This wasn't just a story of revenge, it was a story of reclaiming power, rewriting legacy, and finding freedom in the ashes of betrayal. And with that, a new chapter began. One I was ready to write on my own terms.